A kind delivery girl carried a sick boy to the hospital, unaware he was the son of the reclusive CEO she'd just met. "Get out. We don't serve your kind of filth here." The pounding rain hammered against the worn asphalt of the city streets, a relentless and unforgiving rhythm that echoed the desperate thudding in Alara's own chest. Each drop that splattered against her thin helmet visor felt like a tiny, cold judgment, blurring the flickering neon lights of the metropolis into a watercolor painting of sorrow and haste. She gripped the handlebars of her battered delivery scooter, her knuckles white and trembling, a stark contrast to the grimy, rain-soaked fabric of her threadbare gloves. The biting cold had seeped deep into her bones hours ago, but she barely registered it now, her focus narrowed to a single, fragile point. The crumpled receipt tucked into her jacket pocket, the last order of a grueling 12-hour shift. This one delivery, just this one last journey through the storm-lashed canyons of steel and glass, was all that stood between her and the money she so desperately needed for her mother's medicine. The thought of her mother, frail and pale in that sterile hospital bed, was a constant, hollow ache behind her ribs, a quiet whisper of motivation that pushed her through the exhaustion and the chill. A sudden gust of wind tore at her, nearly wrenching the scooter from her control, and she winced as the icy spray found its way through a tear in her jacket, a cruel reminder of her own fragile state. She was so very tired. The building address on the receipt led her to a part of the city that had long been forgotten by progress, a grim collection of low-rise apartment blocks where shadows clung to the corners like ancient moss. The rain fell heavier here, pooling in the cracked pavement and turning the world into a mirror of the weeping, slate-gray sky. She parked her scooter, its sputtering engine dying with a pathetic cough, and made her way towards a dimly lit entryway. The brown paper bag containing a simple order of soup and bread held tightly against her chest to shield it from the deluge. As she pushed open the heavy, groaning door, she stepped not into a lobby, but into a scene of raw, unspoken panic that seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. A man, his clothes as worn and soaked as her own, was kneeling on the grimy linoleum floor, his gaunt face a mask of sheer terror. His shoulders shook with a violent tremor, and his hands, though large and calloused, looked utterly helpless as they hovered over the small, fragile form of a little boy who was curled on the floor, his breathing a terrifying, ragged rasp. The child's face was ashen, his lips tinted a frightening shade of blue, and his small chest hitched with each desperate, shallow gasp for air. The man looked up as Alara entered, his eyes meeting hers, and in their haunted depths, she saw a despair so profound it felt like a physical blow. They were hollow, shattered things, the eyes of a man who had lost everything and was about to lose the one thing he had left. He was completely alone. Alara froze. For a single, seismic heartbeat, the world contracted to the sound of that terrible, splintered breathing and the relentless drumming of the rain outside. Her own problems, the job, the money, her mother, vanished like mist. Here was a suffering more immediate, more raw than her own weary struggle. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out, only a choked sob that he swallowed down with a painful gulp. He looked utterly broken, a father watching his child slip away in a dingy, forgotten hallway. The delivery bag in her arms suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a symbol of a world of mundane concerns that had no place in this sacred, terrifying moment. A voice in her head, the practical, tired voice of survival, screamed at her to leave the food, take the money, and run. But another voice, a deeper, quieter one that sounded so much like her mother's, spoke of a shared humanity that transcended circumstance. She saw not a stranger, but a father. She saw not a nameless child, but a life flickering like a candle in the storm. Her own heart thudded wildly, a frantic drum against the silence of the man's despair. She took a steadying breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She made a choice. Without a word, she dropped the delivery bag to the floor, its contents forgotten. She knelt down beside the trembling man, her movements gentle and unwavering. "We need to get him to a hospital. Now," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the thick fog of his panic. The man just stared at her, his expression one of utter, stunned disbelief, as if an angel had just appeared in the squalor of his personal hell. He seemed incapable of movement, paralyzed by his fear. Alara didn't wait for a response. With a tenderness that defied the urgency of the moment, she carefully slipped her arms under the little boy's body, gathering his frighteningly light form against her chest. The child, Leo, felt as fragile as a bird, his small head lolling against her shoulder, his feverish heat radiating through her soaked jacket. She rose to her feet, the boy a precious, terrifying weight in her arms. "Which way is the nearest clinic?" she asked, her gaze steady and unflinching. The man, whose name was Julian, could only point with a trembling hand down the dark, rain-swept street. He didn't know it yet. None of them did, but this single, selfless act of kindness had just altered the course of all their lives. She turned and ran out into the storm, abandoning her scooter, her job, and her last hope of payment for the night, carrying a stranger's dying son as if he were her own. He was all that mattered. The city lights were a cruel, indifferent blur as Alara ran, her own breathing now coming in ragged bursts that matched the desperate rhythm of the child's in her arms. The pounding rain was a physical force, plastering her hair to her face and trying to tear the boy from her grasp. But she held on tighter, her entire being focused on the singular goal of reaching the distant, sterile glow of the hospital sign. Julian stumbled along behind her, his longer legs struggling to keep pace, his face a mess of rain and tears. He was a ghost trailing in the wake of her fierce, protective energy, his mind still reeling from the sudden, miraculous appearance of this stranger. One moment he was drowning in the darkest depths of his private grief. The next this girl, this delivery girl with eyes full of a quiet, dignified strength, had become his anchor. She was a beacon in his storm. The journey felt like an eternity, each step a battle against the elements and the crushing weight of fear. The child in her arms gave a small, weak whimper, a sound that splintered Alara's heart and spurred her onward, her weary muscles screaming in protest. She ignored the burning in her lungs and the ache in her limbs. She just ran. They burst through the automatic doors of the emergency room in a spray of rainwater and desperation, a chaotic whirlwind in the otherwise sterile silence of the waiting area. A nurse looked up, her expression hardening from boredom to annoyance at the puddle they were creating on the polished floor. "What is it?" she asked, her tone crisp and impatient. Before Julian could find his voice, Alara stepped forward, her own voice steady despite her trembling body. "He can't breathe," she said, the words simple and devastating. "His fever is high, and he's not responsive." The nurse's eyes flickered from Alara's threadbare jacket to Julian's equally disheveled appearance, and a look of cold dismissal settled on her face. "You'll have to fill out the paperwork and provide a deposit." Triage is backed up. Alara's heart sank. A deposit, of course. She glanced at Julian, who looked even more lost and helpless under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital than he had in the dim hallway. He fumbled in his pockets, pulling them out to show they were empty. His wallet, his phone, everything was back in the apartment, forgotten in the blind panic. He had nothing. The nurse's lips thinned into a line of disapproval. Total silence. It was in that moment of heavy, judgmental silence that Alara's phone began to buzz violently in her pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers clumsy with cold, and saw her boss's name flashing on the cracked, water-damaged screen. She answered with a sense of impending doom. "Where are you?" he barked, his voice tinny and furious. "The customer from Elm Street has been calling for 10 minutes. The soup is cold. You're useless." She tried to explain, her voice cracking with the strain. "I'm sorry, sir. There was an emergency. A little boy." But he cut her off, his words like shards of glass. "I don't pay you for emergencies. I pay you to deliver food. You're fired, Alara. Don't even bother coming back for your pay." The line went dead. The words echoed in the sterile air around her. Fired. Just like that. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the reality of her situation crashing down with unbearable force. No job. No money for her mother's medicine. Nothing. Yet, when she looked down at the pale, still face of the child in her arms, a profound sense of resolve washed away the despair. This was more important. This life was more important. She turned back to the nurse, her expression unwavering. "How much is the deposit?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The nurse named a sum that made Alara's blood run cold. It was almost every last cent she had in the world. The money she had painstakingly saved. The money meant for her mother. She didn't hesitate. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the small, worn fold of bills. It was a sacred offering, the cost of her own hope. With a steady hand, she placed the money on the counter. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Help him." The nurse, finally seeming to grasp the gravity of the situation, scooped up the cash and nodded curtly, and a moment later, a team of doctors was rushing Leo away on a gurney. Julian could only watch, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and shame. This woman, this complete stranger, had just sacrificed everything for his son. She had lost her job, given her last dollar, all for him. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but only a choked gasp escaped. She was gone. Hours later, the sterile silence of the waiting room had become a character in itself, a heavy blanket of anxiety and exhaustion. Alara sat on a hard plastic chair, her clothes still damp. A deep, weary ache settled into her bones. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind the hollow reality of her choices. She was jobless, penniless, and her mother was still waiting. Yet, a strange calm had settled over her. She had done the right thing. That knowledge was a tiny, flickering light in the overwhelming darkness. A soft click of a door opening broke the silence, and a doctor emerged, his expression tired but gentle. Julian, who had been pacing a frantic path in the hallway, rushed forward. "My son?" he asked, his voice cracking. The doctor smiled faintly. "He's going to be all right. A severe asthmatic reaction complicated by a high fever. You got him here just in time. A few more minutes." He let the sentence hang in the air, a testament to the life-or-death race they had run. Julian's legs gave out, and he sagged against the wall, a sob of pure, cathartic relief shaking his entire frame. His eyes found Alara's across the room, and the look he gave her was one of profound, unspoken gratitude. A debt so immense it could never be put into words. Once Leo was settled in a pediatric room, stabilized and sleeping peacefully with an oxygen mask over his small face, Julian found Alara by the vending machines. She was staring blankly at the colorful rows of snacks, not having the single coin required to purchase any of them. He approached her quietly, his heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and deep, humbling guilt. He looked at her worn-out shoes, the tear in her jacket, the pale, exhausted tint of her skin, and he understood the true scale of her sacrifice. I don't know how to thank you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved his life. You saved my life." Alara offered a small, tired smile. "I'm just glad he's okay," she said, her sincerity as pure and clear as spring water. "You're his father. That's all that matters." He fumbled for words, desperate to convey the seismic shift she had caused within him. "My name is Julian," he said. "And the boy, he's Leo." He paused, then added, "I don't have any money with me right now. I can't even pay you back for the deposit." She just shook her head. "Don't worry about it," she said gently. "Just take care of your son." She knew she should leave, that she had her own overwhelming problems to face, but she felt a strange, undeniable connection to this man and his child. It was a bond forged in shared terror and miraculous relief. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, two strangers bound by a sacred event. Then, with a quiet nod, Alara turned to leave. She had to figure out how she was going to face the morning. As she walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, Julian watched her go, his heart a painful knot in his chest. He didn't even know her name. He just knew he had to find her. This couldn't be the end. The next morning, the city was washed clean by the storm, bathed in a soft golden glow that felt like a lie. For Alara, the world was grayer than ever. She walked back to her small, sparse apartment in a daze, the eviction notice taped to her door a stark white flag of surrender. The landlord's angry words from the week before echoed in her ears. She had been so close to catching up. Now it was hopeless. She slumped onto her thin mattress, the springs groaning in protest, and pulled out a small, worn photograph of her mother. Her mother's smile was brave, but her eyes were weary, haunted by the illness that was slowly stealing her away. A single, hot tear traced a path down Alara's cheek. She had failed her. She had chosen a stranger over her own family, and now she would pay the price. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her, threatening to shatter her quiet resolve. She had nothing left. She was utterly and completely alone. Meanwhile, across town, in a cavernous, sun-drenched penthouse apartment overlooking the entire city, Julian stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the gleaming skyline reflecting in his unwavering eyes. He was no longer the gaunt, desperate man from the hallway. Dressed in a crisp, impeccably tailored suit, he exuded an aura of quiet, commanding power. This was his true form, Julian Croft, the reclusive, enigmatic CEO of Croft Enterprises, a global technology empire. He had been living in that rundown apartment for 6 months, a self-imposed exile from a world of wealth that felt hollow and meaningless after his wife's sudden death a year prior. He had wanted to give Leo a normal life, away from the sterile trappings of money, but in his grief-stricken paranoia, he had almost cost his son everything. The memory of last night, the terror, his own helplessness, and the appearance of that girl, played over and over in his mind. She was an anomaly, a spark of pure, selfless light in his dark, transactional world. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. She had wanted nothing and had given everything. The thought was a seismic revelation, cracking open the shell of grief and cynicism that had encased his heart. He felt a profound, undeniable sense of purpose blooming within him, a need not just to repay her, but to understand her, to protect her. He picked up his sleek phone and dialed his assistant. "Arthur," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to find someone. She's a delivery driver. I don't have a name. All I know is that last night, she was an angel. He would find her. He would move heaven and earth to find her and restore the hope she had so freely given away." His search began. 2 days later, a miracle occurred in Alara's bleak existence. A crisp white envelope appeared under her door, containing no letter, only a cashier's check from an anonymous source that was more than enough to cover her back rent and a month in advance. She stared at it, her heart pounding with disbelief. It had to be a mistake. People like her didn't get miracles. The next day, as she was leaving her building to begin the humiliating search for a new job, she found a brand new, gleaming delivery scooter parked where her old, battered one used to be. A simple note was attached to the handlebars. It read, "For a new beginning." There was no signature. Alara's hands trembled as she touched the polished chrome. Who was doing this? Fear mingled with a fragile, burgeoning hope in her chest. The most profound shock, however, came in the form of a call from the hospital where her mother was staying. The stern administrator, a woman who usually spoke to Alara with thinly veiled contempt, was now almost fawning. "Miss Alara," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I have wonderful news. An anonymous benefactor has cleared your mother's entire outstanding medical balance. In fact, they've established a fund to cover all of her future treatments. She's being moved to our finest private suite this afternoon." Alara dropped the phone, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. She sank to the floor, tears of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude streaming down her face. It was too much. The kindness was too vast, too impossible. A single, bewildering thought echoed in her mind. Julian. Could it be him? But that was impossible. He was a poor, struggling father just like her. He couldn't be the source of this cascade of fortune. The mystery only deepened, wrapping her in a sense of wonder and a quiet, unspoken awe for the hidden savior she could not name. The final anonymous gift was the one that would change everything. A formal letter arrived on ornate, heavy stationery, offering her a position as a personal assistant in the executive wing of Croft Enterprises. The salary listed was astronomical, a figure she couldn't even comprehend. It felt like a dream, a cruel joke. She had no qualifications, no experience. But at the bottom of the letter was a handwritten postscript in elegant, familiar ink. I believe kindness and integrity are the most important qualifications. Please, I insist. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but the sentiment resonated deep within her soul. With nothing left to lose and a heart full of desperate curiosity, she accepted the interview. The Croft Enterprises Tower was a gleaming spear of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the heavens, a monument to a world of power and wealth she had only ever seen from a distance. She felt small and out of place in her one good but slightly worn blouse as the sleek, silent elevator carried her to the top floor. A polite but distant assistant led her through a cavernous, polished marble lobby and stopped before a pair of immense oak doors. "Mr. Croft will see you now," she said, her voice a soft hush. Alara's heart thudded against her ribs. This was it. The door swung open, revealing an office that was larger than her entire apartment, with a window that held the entire city in its panoramic grasp. And sitting behind a massive, ornate desk, silhouetted against the golden afternoon light, was a man. As he stood and turned to face her, the breath caught in her throat. It was Julian, not the desperate, gaunt man from the rainy hallway, but a commanding, impeccably dressed stranger who wore his power like a perfectly tailored suit. His eyes, however, were the same, filled with that same raw, profound emotion she remembered. They were the eyes of the man whose son she had saved. He froze her in place. "Alara," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that filled the sterile silence of the room. Her name on his lips sounded both foreign and deeply familiar. She could only stare, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images of this man, the shattered father in the rain and the powerful CEO standing before her. 1,000 questions swirled in her head, but she couldn't form a single one. Julian saw the disbelief and confusion warring in her sincere, beautiful eyes, and his heart ached. He had orchestrated this reunion so carefully, yet he was unprepared for the sheer force of seeing her again. He gestured to a plush armchair opposite his desk. "Please sit," he said softly. She moved as if in a trance, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She sank into the chair, the soft leather a shocking contrast to the hard plastic of the hospital waiting room. Julian rounded the desk and perched on its edge, closing the distance between them, wanting to dispel the intimidating aura of his position. "I owe you an explanation," he began, his gaze unwavering. "And an apology." He told her everything. He spoke of his wife, Amelia, and the vibrant life they had shared before a sudden illness had snatched her away. He described the suffocating grief that followed, the feeling that his world of wealth and success was nothing but a gilded cage. He explained his decision to retreat from that world, to live a simple, anonymous life in that rundown building, all in a desperate attempt to shield his son, Leo, from the emptiness that haunted their stately mansion. "I was trying to protect him," Julian's voice cracked, the raw emotion of that night still close to the surface. "But my fear made me careless. I was so lost in my own pain, I nearly lost him, too. And then you appeared. In the darkest moment of my life, you were there." He looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You didn't know me. You had every reason to walk away, to focus on your own struggles. But you didn't. You gave everything you had for a stranger. That rent money, the new scooter, your mother's medical bills. It's a pitifully small repayment for the gift you gave me, Alara. You didn't just save Leo's life. You reminded me how to live mine. You woke me up." Alara listened, her initial shock slowly melting away, replaced by a profound, tender empathy. She wasn't looking at a CEO anymore. She was seeing the grieving husband, the terrified father. She saw the real Julian. When he finished, the room was filled with a heavy, unspoken understanding. She finally found her voice, a quiet whisper. "Your son," she said. "How is he?" A warm, genuine smile transformed Julian's face. "He's asking for you," he said. "He calls you the rainy day angel." A soft blush colored Alara's cheeks. That evening, Julian insisted on driving her to the hospital to see her mother. Her mother was sitting up in a luxurious private suite, surrounded by flowers, looking healthier and more rested than Alara had seen her in years. The reunion was emotional, full of tears and quiet chuckles. Later, Julian invited Alara to his mansion for dinner, a quiet affair in a cavernous dining room that felt both grand and lonely. It was there, over a simple meal of tea and sandwiches that he insisted on making himself, that they truly connected. He confessed his deep, hollowing loneliness, the feeling of being a ghost in his own opulent home. And she, in turn, shared her own story, the quiet dignity of her struggle, the constant worry for her mother, the simple, selfless dreams she had long since packed away. They talked for hours, their shared experiences of loss and grief forging a powerful, undeniable bond between them. They were two broken souls who had found in each other a kindred spirit. The scene ended not with a dramatic kiss, but with a simple, gentle gesture. As she was about to leave, Julian placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "Thank you, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. It was a moment of profound, sacred connection. A new hope began. To properly thank Alara and introduce her to his world in a meaningful way, Julian invited her and her now recovering mother to be his guests of honor at the annual St. Jude's Hospital Charity Gala. It was the most important philanthropic event of the year, a glittering affair held in a grand ballroom filled with the city's elite. Alara felt impossibly nervous in the elegant, simple blue dress Julian had gifted her, a stark contrast to her usual worn delivery uniform. She felt like an imposter among the gleaming jewels and crisp tuxedos. Her mother, however, beamed with pride, her health restored by the best care money could buy, a living testament to Julian's quiet intervention. Julian was a perfect gentleman, his presence by her side a calm, protective shield. He introduced her not as a project or a discovery, but with a simple, dignified respect that made her feel seen and valued. For a while, the evening was magical. Then, as Julian was momentarily called away by the hospital chairman, the dream splintered. A woman with a severe haircut and a face etched with perpetual disapproval approached Alara, her eyes cold and sharp. It was Mrs. Albright, the head administrator from the first hospital, the woman who had demanded a deposit for a dying child. "Well, well," Mrs. Albright sneered, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to turn and listen. "Look what we have here. I remember you." The filthy little delivery girl Alara froze, the color draining from her face. Her mother placed a worried hand on her arm. "I'm surprised to see you in a place like this," Mrs. Albright continued, her lips twisting into a cruel smile. "You must be very good at what you do. Did you cry and beg this time, too? Or did you find a wealthier fool to prey on?" The words were venomous, designed for maximum public humiliation. A hush fell over their corner of the ballroom as people began to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Alara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, dissecting her. She stood there, dignified but trembling, her throat tight with unspoken words. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but her voice was trapped. The humiliation was a physical thing, a biting cold that seeped into her bones. She felt as fragile and exposed as she had that night in the rain. She was back to being nothing. "Excuse me." A calm, commanding voice cut through the toxic silence. Julian had returned, his expression unreadable but for the dangerous glint in his eyes. He moved to stand directly in front of Alara, placing himself between her and her accuser, a solid, unwavering shield. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer force of his presence was enough to make Mrs. Albright falter. "I believe you were addressing my guest," Julian said, his tone deceptively soft, yet laced with steel. Mrs. Albright, flustered by the unexpected intervention from the powerful Julian Croft, tried to recover. "Mr. Croft, I was just pointing out that this woman is not who she appears to be. She is a grifter who uses sob stories to take advantage of people. She caused a scene at my hospital just last week." She looked smug, certain she had one. Julian's gaze remained fixed on her, his silence more intimidating than any shout. He let her words hang in the air, allowing the entire crowd to absorb their cruelty. Then he spoke, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the now silent ballroom. "You are mistaken, Mrs. Albright," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. "This woman, Elara, is exactly who she appears to be. She is the most honorable, selfless, and compassionate person in this room." He turned his gaze from the administrator to the assembled guests, his eyes sweeping over the sea of curious faces. "Last week, my son was gravely ill. I was not myself. I had nothing. I was a desperate man in a hallway with a dying child. People walked past. People ignored us. But not Elara," he paused, his voice thick with emotion. "This woman, this filthy little delivery girl, as you so eloquently put it, abandoned her job without a second thought. She used her own body to shield my son from a storm and ran on foot to your hospital. And when you, Mrs. Albright, demanded a deposit before you would treat a child who couldn't breathe, Elara paid it. She paid it with the last dollar she had in this world. Money she had saved for her own sick mother." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely annihilated. Mrs. Albright's face went from smug to pale white. She looked shattered. Julian wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his commanding presence shrinking the administrator until she seemed to physically wither. "You speak of grifters and sob stories," he continued, his voice now ringing with cold fury. "But the only indecency I see here tonight is a woman who would put a price on a child's life. A woman who values paperwork over a human heart." He turned to the hospital chairman, who had been watching the scene unfold with a horrified expression. "As this hospital's single largest private donor," Julian stated, each word a hammer blow, "I am making a new, immediate donation of $10 million to fund the construction of a new pediatric wing. It will be named the Elara Vance Wing for Compassionate Care. And its first and most important charter will be that no child is ever denied treatment for lack of funds." The ballroom erupted in applause. Julian held up a hand for silence. "This donation is conditional," he added, his eyes locking back onto the trembling administrator. "It is conditional upon the immediate and permanent dismissal of Mrs. Albright." The chairman nodded quickly, his face grim. "Consider it done, Mr. Croft." Utterly vanquished, Mrs. Albright turned and fled, her public execution complete. Julian then did something no one expected. He turned back to Elara, his expression softening, his eyes filled with a raw, tender vulnerability. In front of the entire elite society of the city, he took her hands in his. "Elara," he said, his voice now for her alone, "you showed me what it means to have a pure heart. You and Leo are my family now. I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you ran out into that rain." He looked at her, his soul bare. "Be with me. Share my life. Let me spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of a love as selfless as yours." Tears streamed down Elara's face, not of humiliation or sorrow, but of pure, cathartic joy. In that moment, surrounded by strangers, she had never felt more at home. "Yes," she whispered. It was a promise. 1 year later, the world was a different place. The amber hue of a late afternoon sun bathed the lush green gardens of the Croft estate in a warm, golden glow. The air was filled with the soft hush of rustling leaves and the distant, happy sound of a child's quiet chuckle. Elara sat on a soft blanket spread out on the grass, a book of fairy tales open in her lap. She was no longer the weary, haunted girl in a threadbare jacket. Dressed in a simple, flowing sundress, her face was relaxed and full of a serene light, the shadows of her past hardships banished by a year of unwavering love and security. Curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap, was Leo. He was a picture of health, his cheeks rosy, his breathing easy and steady. He pointed a small finger at a picture of a knight in shining armor. "He's like Papa," Leo said, his voice clear and bright. Elara smiled, a gentle, sincere smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, stroking his hair. He is a little distance away. Julian stood watching them, his hands tucked into the pockets of his casual trousers. The hollow, haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound sense of peace. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was a husband and a father, his heart full to bursting. He watched as Alara leaned down and whispered something in Leo's ear that made the boy erupt in a fit of giggles. The sound was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. This was his life now, this quiet, sacred, unbelievable joy. He walked over and sat down on the blanket, wrapping his arms around both of them, pulling them into a warm, gentle embrace. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, her contentment a palpable presence between them. They didn't need words. Their shared silence was filled with an unspoken testament to their journey. A story of a rainy night, a selfless act, and a love that had healed 3 broken hearts. They were a family. They were home. This story is a testament to the undeniable power of a single, selfless act of kindness. It reminds us that in a world that can often feel cold and transactional, the purest currency is compassion. Alara, in her moment of deepest hardship, chose empathy over self-preservation. She expected nothing in return, yet her simple, profound act of goodness set in motion a series of events that not only saved a life but also healed a wounded family and created a new one, built on a foundation of gratitude and genuine love. It is a fable of how the light of one small candle can push back the most overwhelming darkness, and how a heart that gives freely will, in the end, receive the entire world. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the beauty of human connection, we hope you will keep its message with you. In a world full of noise and haste, perhaps you too can be someone's rainy day angel. You never know when a small act of kindness might be the miracle that changes a life forever, forging an unspoken bond and bringing light to someone lost in the storm. True wealth is not what we have, but what we give. We pour our souls into creating these emotional journeys for you. To ensure you don't miss our next soul-stirring tale, please like this story, share it with someone who might need a little hope, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to continue bringing inspiring and heartwarming stories to the world. We'll see you in the next one.